With the successful excavation of the peninsula, we had completed the first step in the construction of the Grand Library. As such, spirits were high, and the future was bright. And so, we elected to set our sights temporarily towards making preparations for the new year. We had begun to renovate the spawn region, transforming it into another environment entirely. Stark walls of deep slate surrounded a snaking network of paths that we had created, bestowed with furnishings and flourishes, as would befit them. Expansions to the trading hall were also made, housing a great many villages for all purposes, and aiding us in our efforts going forth. One individual, however, seeing this, found themselves possessed by the spirit of mischief. As we would discover one day during a routine trading session, someone had zombified the entire trading hall, creating a massive horde which outstripped our ability to cure at that time. During my investigation of the damage, I myself was killed, with most of my gear being recovered, save for my boots, which I had taken great pains to refine to perfection. Though I could not explain their absence, they were gone. This, combined with the damage of the incident itself, prompted me to investigate the individual responsible. So I investigated the server's logs, and, as per my suspicion, Skaggs was to blame. With this spark, destruction had been invited into the server, and I hoped to ensure that it did not go unchecked. Unfortunately, it seemed that I had touched a nerve when I investigated the server logs, not only with Skaggs, but with the other members as well. So the rift between myself and the other members widened once more. As an act of revenge, once we fully cured the village, Skaggs began initiating ceaseless raids against the trading hall. This became too much to bear, and Kyrak slew him. I did not intervene. In a fit of rage, Skaggs abandoned the server, taking the dragon egg with him. I would not see him again. We could not let ourselves be deterred. We continued to make improvements to spawn, and make plans for how to continue building the library. Though we saw T1, who had always been a close friend of Skaggs, far less than before. It did not take long, however, for us to discern our next step. Carnamate and I had both observed that the ocean around the library site, that a component of what made it such an enticing locale in the first place, was rather shallow. We agreed it would leave a far more striking impression if it were deeper, so that is what we planned to do. I began making preparations to initiate several massive detonations with the intent of making the ocean substantially deeper than before. It was only after I detonated several thousand cubic meters of explosives that it became clear how futile a task this was for so little return. So, with nothing else to do for the time being, I turned my efforts back towards spawn, which was beginning to grow quite impressive. It had started as naught but a barren savanna, but we had converted it into a dark, dramatic landscape, covered in deep slate and illuminated by street lamps. Our renovations found themselves well timed, as it was now time for the festivities typically brought on by Christmas. It was not difficult to use some of our remaining supplies to add bits of flair as would befit the holiday. So the streets were lined with brightly colored candy canes, and right there, in front of the spawn house, there was a magnificent tree, decorated with lights, ribbons, and other ornamentations. On the day before Christmas, when we were all free of obligation, we held our festivities. Gifts were exchanged, thoughtful words were said, and much joy was had. Even after the typical rituals were concluded, we continued long into the night, talking amongst one another. In the wee hours, we bid our goodbyes, for tomorrow was another day. In the dead of night, after all others had gone, Kyrak logged onto the server. Motivated by some petty slight I had committed against him, he went about destroying the entirety of Spawn, burying it underneath countless tons of rubble. Being of a more nocturnal sort, I awakened quite late into the day, and as a result was among the last to see the destruction. Indeed, it would seem the others had already made their mark upon that colossal wreck. What a fine Christmas gift this was. There was no easily undoing what was already done. This destruction was altogether too vast. The only choice was to revert to the last snapshot I had taken of the world, a keepsake I had hoped never to need. But before we left behind this doomed timeline to the whims of the fates, we decided to bid one last farewell. Alas, the soul of the server was not so easily regained. All Carnamate and I could hope to do was piece together the shards as best as we could. It was only the two of us to carry on our quarry, to carry on the legacy of the server and the memories that accompanied it. Still, we continued onwards and never lost hope that someday we may recapture those days of glory that we once knew so well. With nothing else immediately in sight, we revisited our contemplations on the shallowness of the ocean. We then remembered a plan we'd briefly considered in months prior. The original plan was as such: cover the seafloor in obsidian and excavate underneath it until we were satisfied, and the obsidian could then be removed. This was obviously not viable, which is why it was never given any serious amount of consideration. Although the excavation was pure fantasy, covering the seafloor with obsidian, however, seemed perfectly viable. The dark color of the material would create the illusion of depth by obscuring the true dimensions of the seafloor. To this end we worked quickly. No good could come from tarrying in our work at this stage, lest our solitude become too deafening to continue. With a night's work we constructed a farm and gathered all the obsidian we needed. The task, then, was simple: blanket the vast yawning seafloor in obsidian, as far as the eye can see. It would seem that we could not rest yet. Though I myself was not there to witness it, our server was nearly destroyed by interlopers. We did not know who they were or where they came from, but they sought to destroy our works. Had Carnamate not intervened, they may well have succeeded. We could not rest with threats always at our doorstep, so we devised a plan. Rather than implement a simple whitelist, we decided to make perhaps more practical use of the reserves of obsidian that we had at our disposal. Together, we would design the Bastille, a great, imposing fortress which imprisoned all who joined the server, unless they were released at our behest. In the coming weeks, many more would try to undo us. They would fail, broken against the towering monument to our resilience. Satisfied with our security for the time being, we returned to our work in peace, though Carnamate had other obligations at the time, meaning it was solely up to me to finish the Obsidian Ocean. Some might say it would be folly to waste so much time on so trivial a task, on so minute a detail. To assume as such, however, misses the point of our work entirely. From the grandest of structures to the most subtle of flourishes, these are treated with equal importance. Might alone is worthless without grace. But this work was eventually finished, and it was again time for us to display our might. During my construction of the Obsidian Ocean, Carnamate had constructed a vast cliff face upon which the library would eventually rest. An outline of a cliff on the other side of the ocean was also present. The next task, then, was obvious. Build a bridge spanning the Obsidian Ocean in its entirety, and connect the two regions. This, to be sure, was by far the largest undertaking we had yet faced. Furthermore, in this particular task, we would have no help, no company, other than one another, though it was doubtful the past members would have been of great help, even had they not abandoned us. Though we now numbered only 2, through our perseverance and determination, we had far outshined even the most illustrious of our past achievements when our ranks were at their peak. Our accomplishments were already mighty indeed, and yet they served only as a prelude for what would follow. Soon, we would truly begin to build the Grand Library.